She had one season left to save everything. The farm, the house, the name her husband died protecting, and then the sky opened up. Not rain, not a storm, a wall of brown water that came down from the hills and swallowed 40 years of work in under 6 hours. What happened next, what she did next, is the kind of thing people in that county still talk about in low voices, because it doesn't sit right with how they think the world is supposed to work. Stay with me. Before we get into the flood, I need to ask you something. There's a moment in this story where a woman who has already lost almost everything gets handed one more loss. And instead of breaking, she does the one thing nobody expected. I want to know if you've ever been in a situation like that, where losing something forced you to become someone you didn't know you were. Leave your answer in the comments and tell me what city you're watching from. I read every single one of those. If this kind of story moves you, hit the like button right now and subscribe, because we tell the ones that get left out of the history books. All right, let's go back to Harlan County, to a woman named Una, a failing farm, and a flood that changed everything. The land had been in the Voss family for 3 generations. That's not a metaphor, that's a deed. Signed in 1931 by a man named August Voss, Una's grandfather-in-law, who bought 47 acres of bottomland near the creek for what amounted to a season's wages and a handshake. The soil there was dark and heavy and sweet, the kind that holds moisture through a dry summer and releases it slowly, like it's rationing something precious. For decades, the Voss family grew corn and tobacco, and later, when the tobacco market caved, they transitioned to soybeans and a small herd of Angus cattle. They weren't rich, but they were never desperate. The land provided. That was the bargain. You work the land works for you. Una married into the family when she was 23 years old. Her maiden name was Ferrell, and she came from a completely different world. Her father, Glenn, was an electrician from the city, and her mother, Ida, had worked in a textile mill until the mill closed. Una hadn't grown up around farming. She'd grown up around work, which turned out to be close enough. Her husband was Carlisle Voss, a quiet man with large hands and a dry sense of humor that took some time to appreciate. He taught Una everything: how to read the sky, how to test soil pH, how to castrate a calf without flinching, how to negotiate a grain contract without flinching either. They were a good team, the kind you don't recognize as rare until you've seen enough partnerships that aren't. They had one son, Dax, who grew up on the farm and left at 18 to study agriculture at the state university. He graduated, got a job with a cooperative 3 counties over, got married to a woman named Lupe, and called on Sundays. He was a good son. He just wasn't there. Carlisle died of a heart attack on a Tuesday morning in late October, 7 years before this story takes place. He was 58 years old. He was checking on the cattle when it happened. His hired hand, a young man named Wiley, found him face down in the mud near the fence line. The coroner said he'd been gone for at least an hour before anyone knew. Una was in the kitchen when Wiley came to the door. She knew from the look on his face before he said a word. She let him in, listened, thanked him, and then sat down at the kitchen table and didn't move for a long time. She told her son later, "I wasn't crying. I was calculating, because the farm didn't stop needing to be run, because Carlisle was dead. The cattle still needed feeding. The loan on the equipment still came due. The contract with the grain elevator had a performance clause. If you didn't deliver a minimum yield, they could renegotiate the rate downward, and a lower rate on 47 acres was the difference between surviving a bad year and not. So Una ran the farm. She hired Wiley full-time and brought on a second hand, a retired farmer named Such, who worked for lower wages in exchange for being allowed to sleep in the bunkhouse and not be alone. She renegotiated the equipment loan herself, sitting across a desk from a banker named Ord at the county branch of First Meridian Savings, and she didn't leave until she had terms she could live with. She survived the first year, and the second, and the third. But farming on the margin is like walking a tightrope that keeps getting thinner. Every year there was something. A drought that cut the soybean yield, a cattle disease that required a vet bill Una hadn't budgeted for, a hailstorm in July that flattened half the corn. She absorbed each one. She adapted. By the 6th year after Carlyle's death, she was carrying a second mortgage and was behind on 2 of the quarterly payments to the grain elevator. The operation was still running, but just barely. The kind of barely you can feel in your chest when you look at the books at night. A land developer had come through the county 18 months earlier, a company called Ridgecroft Holdings, represented locally by a man named Paxton, and had made offers on several farms in the area. Most of the offers were below market, but the pitch was clean. Take the money now, avoid the uncertainty. Una declined. She didn't explain why. She just said no. Paxton came back twice more. The third time, he brought papers. The offer was slightly higher, but the deadline was explicit: 90 days. She had 90 days to turn the operation around, to deliver a strong enough harvest that First Meridian would restructure the mortgage and Ridgecroft would lose its leverage. That was the setup. And then it rained. The forecast had called for heavy precipitation, but in Harlan County, heavy precipitation was a weekly occurrence in spring. Nobody took it seriously. Wiley patched a section of the fence that had been sagging since January. Such spread a light herbicide treatment on the north field. Una drove into town to pick up seed from the co-op and stopped at the diner for coffee, where she ran into the county extension agent, a slow-talking man named Ferris, who mentioned that the water table was already high from the winter thaw, and that this particular system coming in from the southwest was larger than the Weather Service was letting on. Una drove home faster than she'd driven in. By 4 in the afternoon, the rain had started. By 7, it was a different kind of rain, not the steady drumming kind, but the falling in sheets kind, the kind that makes you feel like the sky itself has lost its form. Una stood on the back porch and watched the creek at the far edge of the property. Under normal conditions, you could barely see it from the house. That evening, she could hear it. She called Dax. He didn't pick up. It was Sunday, which usually meant he and Lupe had dinner with Lupe's parents. She left a message that said in its entirety, "The creek's running high. Call me when you get this." She called Wiley next and told him to move the cattle to the upper pasture, the high ground beyond the south tree line, where the elevation kept it safe from all but the worst flooding. Wiley hesitated. Moving cattle in the dark and rain was miserable work, and the upper pasture was a 20-minute drive by tractor. Una said, "I know, do it anyway." Then she started moving things herself. The equipment barn sat at the bottom of a gentle slope, closer to the creek than she'd ever felt comfortable with. Inside it were 2 tractors, a combined harvester, a planter, and an inventory of parts and attachments that had accumulated over 4 decades. Some of it was irreplaceable, not because of cost, but because the specific models were discontinued, and Carlyle had been the kind of man who kept things running long past when anyone else would have junked them. She couldn't move the heavy machinery, but she could move the parts bins, the seed inventory, the tool chests, the documentation, the ownership papers, maintenance records, warranty cards, all of it stored in a metal filing cabinet that Carlyle had pushed into the corner of the barn the day they bought the property and never moved since. Una backed the farm pickup to the barn door and started loading. She worked for 3 hours. The rain never let up. At one point, her boots sank 4 inches into the mud near the barn entrance, and she had to pull herself free with both hands, losing 1 boot in the process and having to reach back into the mud to retrieve it. Such showed up at 11, having driven over from his bunkhouse on his own initiative. He didn't say much, just looked at what she was loading, assessed the situation, and started hauling alongside her without asking for direction. This was the thing about Such. He had worked farms his whole life. He understood the calculus. By midnight, the pickup was full, and they'd moved the most critical items to the main house, stacked in the hallway, the dining room, the living room. The furniture was shoved against the walls. The house looked ransacked. Una didn't care. At 2:14 in the morning, the creek broke its bank. She knew it before she saw it. There was a sound, not like rushing water, but like something very large shifting its weight. Then 20 minutes later, the beam of Such's flashlight caught the first tongue of brown water moving across the lower pasture. It moved slower than you'd think. That was the terrible thing about floodwater. It didn't crash, it crept, and by the time you understood what it was doing, it had already encircled you. Una watched from the rise behind the house. The equipment barn was below the floodline. In the flashlight beam, she could see water pressing at the base of the barn doors, testing the gaps. She had done what she could do. The machinery itself was beyond saving. "We need to document," she said to Such. "Now, right now." She went back inside and found the camera she'd kept in the kitchen drawer for years, a digital point-and-shoot that still worked, though the charging cable had gone missing, and she'd been running it on the original battery since sometime last spring. She took it outside and started photographing the floodline, the barn, the pasture, the outbuildings. Such held a flashlight. She moved methodically, grid by grid, the way Carlyle had taught her to survey damage after hailstorms. Documentation is a form of argument. That was something the insurance adjuster, a man named Brew, had said to her after the 2019 hailstorm. Half as advice, half as warning. The more you can show us, the less we have to decide for ourselves. She shot 140 photographs before the camera finally died. Then she went inside, made coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and started making a list. Not of what she'd lost, of what she still had. By dawn, the water had reached its peak and was beginning very slowly to recede. The lower pasture was submerged under about 3 feet. The equipment barn had taken in water up to the wheel wells of the tractors, which meant the engines were intact, but every electrical component at axle height or below was likely compromised. The planter was partly submerged. The harvester had fared better, sitting on slightly higher ground at the back of the barn. The fields, the 47 acres of tillable ground that represented the entire purpose of the operation, were under water. The soybean crop that had been in the ground for 3 weeks was gone. Una stood at the edge of the flooded pasture in the grey morning light and let that fact settle into her completely. She didn't fight it. She had learned, over 7 years of managing grief and crisis, that fighting a fact was a way of wasting energy you were going to need later. Dax called at 6 a.m. He'd seen the news alerts. His voice was tight with the particular anxiety of someone who is worried but far away and aware of the distance. "Mom, how bad is it?" "Bad," she said, "but manageable." A pause. "Mom." "Dax, I know what manageable means. I'm not saying it to make you feel better. I'm saying it because I've been up all night thinking about it, and I believe it." Another pause. Longer. "What do you need?" "Right now? Nothing. In 3 days, I'm going to need you to make some calls for me. People you know from the co-op. I need to find out about emergency seed loans, USDA disaster certification, and whether anyone has a late plant soybean variety with a short window." He was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, she could hear something shift in him. The anxiety hadn't gone, but it had organized itself. "I'll start making calls today." 3 days, she said. "Let me assess first." The assessment took 2 days. She walked every acre with Wiley and Such. She took notes on a legal pad in a handwriting that had gotten more precise over the years, not less. Carlyle used to joke that her handwriting improved under stress, like pressure made her careful. She made notes on drainage patterns, identified the sections that had recovered fastest from previous floods, and catalogued where the sediment had deposited most heavily, because flood sediment, depending on its composition, could either improve the soil or lock it up. The county extension agent, Ferris, came out on the second day. He was a careful, undramatic man who had been in the job long enough to have seen everything, and he walked the property without saying much. At the end, standing at the edge of the road, he told her that the sediment deposit appeared to be primarily silt from the creek bed, which meant relatively high organic matter, and that the fields would drain faster than they looked. He estimated she could be planting again in 12 to 15 days if the weather held. 12 to 15 days, she repeated. Best case. She did the math in her head. The latest viable planting date for soybeans in the county was late May. They were currently in early May. If she could plant in 12 days, she'd be within the window, barely, but within it. The yield would be lower than a full season crop, but it would be a yield. Something to deliver, something to stand on. What she needed was seed, the right variety, enough of it on credit, and she needed the equipment operational. The tractor situation was going to be the pinch. Both machines had taken water damage and needed assessment by someone who knew what they were looking at. She called a mechanic named Trout, who ran a farm equipment repair shop out of a converted dairy barn on Route 9. Trout was not a warm man, but he was precise, which was more useful. He came out the next morning, crawled under both tractors, pulled panels, tested circuits, and delivered his verdict standing at the hood of the pickup. The smaller one, he said, meaning the older model, is going to need a new wiring harness and a fuel pump, 3 days, maybe 4. And the other, he made a face. Control modules fried. That's an order and a wait. How long? 2 weeks, minimum. Could be 3. Una absorbed this. Can you prioritize the smaller one? Already planning on it. She didn't thank him effusively. She thanked him the way farmers thank each other, directly, briefly, meaning it, and drove back to the house. That evening she called Paxton at Ridgecroft Holdings. He picked up on the second ring, which told her he'd been expecting her call. "Ms. Voss," he said. His voice had the careful warmth of someone who has practiced not sounding eager. "I heard about the flooding. I'm sorry." "I'm sure you are," she said. "I'm calling because I want you to understand something." A brief pause. "Of course. Your offer expires in 73 days. I want you to keep that date in your mind, because I'm going to deliver you an answer on day 73, and the answer is going to be no, but I wanted to give you adequate notice so you could redirect your resources." Another pause. Longer this time. "Ms. Voss, with respect, the flood changes your situation considerably. Your crop loss alone—" "I know what my situation is," she said, "better than you do." She hung up. She didn't know when she hung up that phone whether she was right. She didn't know if the farm could be saved. What she knew was that doubt was a luxury that had to be rationed carefully, the same way the soil rationed its moisture, not by eliminating it, but by not letting it run. Word travels fast in farming communities, and not always in the way you'd expect. By the end of the first week after the flood, Una had received 7 calls from neighbors. 3 were expressions of sympathy. 2 were offers of help. 1 from a woman named Bet Ann, who had a functioning tractor and offered to lend it on a scheduling basis, and 1 from a neighboring farmer named Croy, who said he had surplus seed from a variety trial and was willing to sell it at cost, provided she could take it by next Wednesday. 1 call was from a local reporter named Sims, writing a piece about flood damage for the county paper. Una declined to be interviewed. She wasn't ready to become a story. Not yet. And 1 call, the one she hadn't expected, was from a woman named Della, who ran the small business development office at the county seat. Della had read about the flood in Ferris's informal circulated report, which went out to a mailing list of agricultural and business contacts. Della specialized in emergency loan programs for small agricultural producers, and she had information about a state-level disaster credit facility that most farmers in the county didn't know existed. "It doesn't fix everything," Della said on the phone, "but it gives you a bridge." "How long is the bridge?" "Long enough to plant, long enough to harvest. After that, you're back to regular terms." Una was quiet for a moment. "What's the catch?" "You have to apply in person, and you have to bring documentation." "I have documentation," Una said. 140 photographs. Della laughed. A surprised, genuine laugh. "Good. Can you come in Thursday?" "I can come in Wednesday." The application process took 2 days. There were forms and supporting documents and an interview with a program officer named Clement Jr. A careful, balding man who asked questions in a way that made you feel like he was genuinely trying to help you qualify rather than find reasons to decline. He asked about the equipment losses, the crop losses, the mortgage situation, the operating history. Una answered everything directly without embellishment. At the end, Clement Jr. folded his hands on the desk and said, "Your documentation is excellent." "I know," she said. He blinked, then smiled. "We'll process this in 5 to 7 business days." "5," she said. "Please." He looked at her for a moment. "We'll do our best." Meanwhile, the fields were draining. Wiley monitored them every morning and evening, walking the rows with a soil probe, recording moisture levels. He left his notes on the kitchen table each evening, one of those unspoken arrangements that had developed between them over the years. He'd write, she'd read, they'd adjust. They barely needed to talk about it anymore. On day 9 after the flood, Wiley's note said, "North field ready in 2 days, south field 4. Una read it, added a check mark, and went to bed. On day 11, she drove to Croy's farm and picked up the seed. It was a determinate variety, short season, bred for late planting. Not the highest yielder, but reliable, which was what she needed. She loaded 30 bags into the truck bed in the rain, which had started up again, lighter this time. Croy watched her load from under the overhang of his barn. He was a lean, weathered man in his 60s who had farmed the county his whole life and had seen other farms go under. He didn't say anything patronizing. He didn't say anything about the flood or about Ridgecroft or about what she should or shouldn't do. What he said was, "That variety likes a firm seedbed. Don't rush it." "I know," she said. "Thank you, Croy." "Good luck, Una." The loan from the state facility cleared on day 12. Trout had the smaller tractor finished on day 13. Betty Ann's borrowed tractor arrived at the farm on day 14. On day 15, with the north field showing adequate drainage and a weather window that Ferris said would hold for 5 days, Una began to plant. She drove the first tractor herself. Wiley took the second. Such managed logistics, seed bags, fuel, field marking. They worked in overlapping passes, turning at the headlands, keeping rows straight. The soil was heavier than she'd have liked. The flood sediment had changed the texture slightly, made it more cohesive, but the planter was cutting through. The seed was going in at the right depth. She planted for 11 hours the first day. Her back was a disaster by the time she climbed down from the cab. She ate standing at the kitchen counter, too tired to sit, then went to bed and set her alarm for 5 a.m. The second day, she planted for 12 hours. The third day, she finished the north field and started the south. On the evening of the fourth day, she finished. 47 acres, planted late, planted under pressure, planted by a woman who the county's largest land developer had calculated was finally out of options. She sat on the back steps and looked out at the field in the last light. The soil was dark and flat and quiet. You couldn't see the seeds. You couldn't see what was starting. You just had to know it was there. She thought about Carlisle. She thought about August Voss signing that deed in 1931. She thought about her father, Glenn, who had taught her that the dignity in work wasn't in what you produced, it was in refusing to stop. Then she went inside, washed her hands and called her son. "It's in the ground," she said. A pause. Then, "Mom." His voice was full of something she couldn't name. "How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said. "And okay," both at the same time. Planting was the beginning, not the end. The seeds in the ground were a bet, not a guarantee. Late-planted soybeans face a compressed growing season, and a compressed growing season means less margin for error. If August came in dry, the crop would stress at flowering. If the first frost arrived even a week ahead of the historical average, the beans wouldn't reach full maturity. And immature beans delivered against a contract weren't worth what mature beans were. Una knew all of this. She tracked it the way a chess player tracks lines of play, not anxiously, but continuously, because awareness is the only form of control available when you're dealing with weather. She also had other problems to manage. The larger tractor, The one with the fried control module was still at Trout's shop. The replacement part had been back-ordered from the manufacturer's regional warehouse, and the lead time had stretched from 2 weeks to 3. Without it, her capacity for the hay harvest in July was compromised. She had a contract to supply round bales to a beef operation 2 counties over, a small contract, but one that provided a cash infusion at a critical point in the season. She called the beef operator, a woman named Nance, and explained the situation frankly. Nance was a practical person. They renegotiated the delivery schedule. Una would supply the first third of the contracted bales on time using the small tractor and deliver the remainder in 2 subsequent tranches across the summer. Nance agreed, with a small penalty clause for any shortfall. Una accepted the clause. Wiley, meanwhile, had been having a quiet crisis of his own. She noticed it before he said anything. Small signs, the kind that only registered because she'd worked alongside him long enough. He was distracted during morning rounds. He forgot to refuel the small tractor 2 days running. His note leaving on the kitchen table stopped. She found him one evening behind the machine shed, sitting on an overturned bucket, looking at nothing. She sat down on another bucket without asking permission. They stayed quiet for a moment. "My sister called," he finally said. "She needs help. Family situation. She's down in Clover County." "How long?" "I don't know. Could be a couple weeks. Could be more." Una thought about what losing Wiley for even 2 weeks would mean to the operation. Then she thought about the fact that she'd never asked him to put the farm above his family and never intended to. "Go," she said. He looked at her. "The crop, Such and I have managed before. Go take care of your sister." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll pay my own way." "I know you will," she said. "That's not what I'm thinking about." He left 3 days later. Such took on more responsibility without being asked and without complaint. He was 67 years old and moved like a man who'd been working through pain for so long it had become invisible to him. Una watched him and felt something between admiration and worry, the compound feeling of depending on someone while also knowing that the dependence was asking a lot. She hired temporary help twice during the mid-season. The first time, through a labor exchange organized by the Extension Office, 2 men, brothers, who came for a week and were competent if not inspired. The second time, through a different channel, a young woman named Solange, fresh out of an agricultural certificate program at the community college, who came looking for practical experience and ended up staying for 3 weeks. Solange was sharp, fast, and asked good questions. Una told her at the end of the 3rd week that if she wanted a position at the start of next season, she should call. The crop grew. It grew slowly at first. Late-planted beans come up cautious, like they know they're already behind. And then with increasing confidence as June deepened into July. Una walked the rows every few days, checking canopy closure, looking for disease pressure, counting pod sets. The numbers were below what she'd have projected from a full-season crop, but they were real. They were visible. They were there. In the middle of July, Paxton called again. She was in the south field when the call came through, crouched down checking for sudden death syndrome, a fungal disease that loved stressed soybeans. And she almost didn't answer. She answered. "Ms. Voss," Paxton said. His voice was different this time. The careful warmth was gone. What was left was precision. "I'm following up on our conversation. Your deadline is in just over a month. I'm aware. I want to be transparent with you. We've received an updated appraisal of the property, and the market in this corridor it's moving. The offer we have on the table now may not reflect full value in 6 months. Are you telling me the offer is going up?" A pause. "I'm saying conditions are favorable for a transaction." "Paxton," she said, "I told you in May that I would give you an answer on day 73, and the answer would be no. That remains my answer. You don't need to call again." Silence on the line. Then, "Ms. Voss, I want you to understand that if you miss the mortgage restructuring window at First Meridian—" "I know what the window is," she said. I've known what the window is since before you came out here the first time. I don't need you to manage my risk." She ended the call. She stood up from the row and looked across the field. The soybeans were chest high now, green and dense, the rows filling in. In 6 weeks, maybe 7 depending on the weather, they'd be ready to harvest. She did the math. She had done it 100 times, but she did it again. If the yield came in at 75% of her contracted amount, which was conservative, below what she was actually projecting, she could service the debt, make the overdue payments to the grain elevator, and bring First Meridian's account current. Not comfortable, not easy, but current. If the yield came in at 85%, she could do all of that and have a small reserve. If it came in at 90% or above, she'd have options she hadn't had in 2 years. The question was the weather. The question was always the weather. August came in with a threat. The forecast showed a dry period. Not a drought exactly, but 2 weeks without significant rain during the period when the soybeans would be setting seed. Pod fill is the stage of soybean development when moisture stress causes the most damage. A plant under water stress during pod fill produces lighter seeds, fewer pods, or aborts the process entirely. It's the worst possible moment to be dry. Una had always had a rain gauge on the porch post. She started checking it every morning with a precision that was almost ritualistic, the way Carlyle used to check it, the way his father must have before him, the way August Voss probably did in 1931. The first week, 0.3 inches, low. The second week, 0.1 inches, critical. She called Ferris. He was honest with her, which she respected. If it doesn't rain in the next 10 days, you're looking at yield reduction. Could be 15%, could be more. How much more? Depends on the root system. You've got sediment from the flood that may have affected drainage patterns. In some spots, roots are probably deeper than you'd expect. That could help. What's the outlook? Nothing convincing before the end of the month. A pause. "I'm sorry, Una." She thanked him and hung up. She checked the soil moisture herself that evening, probing the rows, recording the numbers. The numbers confirmed what she could already see. The plants were beginning to show the early signs of stress, leaf margins curling slightly in the afternoon heat, the particular posture of a plant that is working harder than it should. She couldn't irrigate. The farm didn't have an irrigation system, never had, because the bottomland had always been reliable enough. Installing one was not a 5-day project, and she didn't have the capital for it anyway. She did the only thing she could do. She applied a foliar micronutrient supplement that Ferris had mentioned could reduce stress response. She checked every row for disease pressure and found and treated a small outbreak of frog eye leaf spot in the southwest corner before it could spread. She made sure the soil wasn't crusted over the rows. Any surface compaction that impeded gas exchange made stress worse. And then she waited. On the 8th day of the dry period, Wiley came back. He arrived at the farm unannounced, his truck pulling in the driveway at 7 in the morning. He climbed out, looking tired but settled, the particular settledness of someone who has done a hard thing and gotten to the other side of it. He'd looked at the fields without saying anything for a long moment. "They're stressed," he said. "I know." "How bad?" "Manageable," she said. And this time, even she wasn't entirely sure she believed it. They stood there together for a moment, looking at the field. Then Wiley went to find Such, and the three of them walked the rows together for the first time in over a month. On the 11th day of the dry period, the rain came. It came in the afternoon, with no particular drama, no thunder, no wind, just a grey sky that had been threatening since morning, finally making good on its threat. Soft, steady rain, the kind that soaks in rather than runs off. Una was in the equipment barn when it started. She heard it on the metal roof, and she stopped what she was doing and stood still and listened to it. She walked outside and stood in it. The rain fell on the fields, on the soybeans, on the dark soil that had been laid down by 3 generations of Voss hands and 1 generation of feral determination. It fell on the equipment barn that had flooded in May, and the house where Carlyle had died, and the fence line where Wiley had found him. It fell on everything that wasn't done yet. She thought about the bank, about Ord sitting behind his desk with the restructuring papers, about Clement Jr. at the state facility who had processed her loan in 5 business days, as she'd asked, about Paxton and his 73-day deadline, which had expired 11 days ago, and which he had not called about again. She thought about what it meant to stand your ground, that it wasn't a dramatic, cinematic thing. It was incremental. It was 11 days without rain, and then checking the soil moisture at night, and then getting up the next morning and doing it again. It was calling your son and not letting your voice crack. It was thanking a man named Croy for seed and knowing that the thanks carried weight because it was given honestly. It was standing in your field in the rain and feeling underneath everything something that was not relief exactly, something more permanent than relief. The rain continued through the night. In the morning, Wiley's note on the kitchen table said, "Good, just that one word." September arrived. The soybeans turned. The leaves went from green to yellow over the course of about 10 days, one of the small miracles of annual agriculture. The color change that means a plant has done its work and is releasing its resources upward into the seed. The pods swelled and dried. The stalks began to brown. Ferris came out for a pre-harvest assessment. He walked the rows with his usual methodical calm, taking samples, weighing pods, counting per row yields. At the end, standing at the truck, he gave her his estimate. 81% of contracted yield, not perfect, not the 90% she'd hoped for, but above the 75% she'd calculated as her break-even point. 81%, she repeated. Give or take. There's some variability in the north field from the sediment. Some spots ran higher, some lower, but 81 is a solid midpoint estimate. She did the math standing right there. 81% meant she could service the debt and make the grain elevator current. It meant the mortgage restructuring would go through. It meant she would make it to next season with the farm intact. It meant Ridgecroft Holdings had nothing to buy. She called Ord at First Meridian that afternoon. She told him the yield estimate and asked to schedule the restructuring meeting. "That's good news, Ms. Voss," he said. He sounded genuinely pleased, in the way of someone whose job involves a lot of the opposite kind of news. "It is," she agreed. Harvest took 9 days. Trout had gotten the larger tractor back to her in late August. Control module replaced, running better than it had in years, he said, because the water damage had required him to rebuild several components that had been slowly degrading for a decade. Una drove it for the harvest and thought that this too was something, that sometimes the damage and the repair leave you better than you were. On the last day of harvest, Dax and Lupe drove out from the city. They arrived in the afternoon, while Una and Wiley were finishing the last pass on the south field. Dax stood at the field's edge and watched the harvester make its final run. When Una climbed down from the cab, he walked over and hugged her. A longer hug than they usually exchanged, the kind that acknowledges something that doesn't have a clean name. "You did it," he said. "We did it," she said. "All of us." She gestured to Wiley, coming across the field, to Such, sitting on the tailgate of the truck, to Ferris's assessment, Della's bridge loan, Croy's seed, Bet Ann's tractor, Trout's repairs, Clement Jr.'s 5-day processing, Solange's 3 weeks of sharp, enthusiastic work, to Carlyle, who had taught her to read the sky, to August Voss, who had bought this land for a handshake and a season's wages, to the soil itself, which had flooded and dried and cracked and been seeded and had delivered, not perfectly, but honestly, which is all the soil has ever promised. The restructuring meeting at First Meridian happened on a Thursday in late October. Una arrived early. She was dressed the way she dressed for serious business, not formally, but deliberately. Clean boots, the good coat, the legal pad she'd been carrying since May, full of notes in precise handwriting. Ord had brought a colleague from the agricultural lending division, a woman named Pre-Wet, who specialized in debt restructuring for farm operations. Pre-Wet was efficient and clear, which Una appreciated. They went through the numbers together, the harvest yield, the contracted delivery, the outstanding balance, the revised payment schedule. Priwet slid the new terms across the table. Una read them carefully. Every line, every clause. It took 12 minutes. Auden Priwet waited without comment, which she appreciated. The terms were livable, not comfortable but livable. Extended repayment on the second mortgage, a reduced interest rate tied to the agricultural disaster program she'd qualified for, and a performance clause that was more flexible than the original. She signed. Ord shook her hand. Priwet said, with what seemed like genuine feeling, "You've done something difficult, Ms. Voss." "The land did most of it," Una said. She drove home. The fields were bare and brown, the way they always are after harvest, stripped of everything they'd been growing, showing the raw earth underneath. In farming, that's not loss. That's the start of next year. You have to learn to see a harvested field as a beginning, not an end. It took Una years after Carlyle's death to relearn that. Paxton did not call again. Ridgecroft Holdings redirected its attention to a different corridor of the county, toward properties whose owners were less certain and whose fields were further from the creek. Una heard about it from Croy, who'd heard it from someone at the co-op. Neither of them commented. There wasn't much to say. Wiley negotiated a slight wage increase for the coming season. Una agreed without countering. He'd earned it. Such retired, formally this time, though he continued to show up twice a week to help with whatever needed doing and to eat lunch in the kitchen. And nobody pretended this was an accident. Solange called in November, as Una had suggested she might. They arranged a start date for March. Dax called on Sunday, the way he always had. The calls were longer now, not dramatically different. He was still 3 counties over, still working at the cooperative, still having Sunday dinners with Lupe's parents. But something between them had shifted. The distance had become somehow less of a weight and more of just a fact. He knew she was managing. She knew he knew. That was enough. Late November, Una walked the north field on a grey afternoon. The soil was cold and quiet. The sediment from the flood had settled. It would take years to fully integrate, but already you could see where it had darkened the existing topsoil, added a layer to a layer that was already deep and rich. She crouched down and took a handful of soil and held it. It compressed correctly in her hand, dense but workable, the way good bottomland soil is supposed to feel. She put it back. She thought about the insurance adjuster, Brew, who had come out in late May and processed the flood claim against the equipment. A claim supported by 140 photographs, which had resulted in a settlement that had covered the repair costs almost exactly. She thought about how Carlyle would have handled all of this, and she thought that probably mostly he would have handled it the same way, and that this was not because she was trying to be him, but because he had taught her what he knew, and she had listened. She walked back to the house. She had work to do, plans to make for next season, seed decisions, equipment maintenance schedules, an application for a soil health program that Ferris had flagged as potentially available to flood-affected producers. The farm needed her. She went in. The story of the Voss farm, if you were to write it down, which this is in a way, does not have the kind of ending that gets turned into a movie. There is no single triumphant moment, no dramatic confrontation where Una stands on her porch and watches the Ridgecroft representative drive away defeated. No speech, no ceremony. What there is, a farm that is still a farm, a woman who is still on her land, soil that was flooded and recovered, seeds that were planted late and delivered anyway. In the spring that followed, Una planted full-season soybeans in the north field and a corn-soybean rotation on the south. The sediment from the previous year's flood had, as Ferris had cautiously predicted, improved the organic matter content of the topsoil in several sections. The north field ran slightly higher yields than it had in 4 years. Solange came in March and stayed the full season. She was good. Better than Una had initially assessed, which was saying something. By midsummer, she was managing the cattle rotation independently and had started keeping her own field notes, which she left on the kitchen table alongside Wiley's. Wiley's sister stabilized. He didn't talk about it in detail, and Una didn't ask. In June, a woman from a regional farming publication called and asked to write a profile. She had heard about the flood, the late planting, the Ridgecroft situation. Una declined. She explained briefly, "The farm isn't a story, it's a farm." The woman tried 3 more approaches. Una was polite each time. The piece was never written. What did get written was a letter. Not a letter to a publication or an institution, but a personal letter. Una wrote it in December of the flood year, sitting at the kitchen table, on an evening when the snow was coming down outside and the house was quiet, and she had finished the books for the quarter and found herself with an hour and nothing that needed doing. She addressed it to her son. She told him things she hadn't told him on the Sunday calls, the specific shape of the fear she'd felt the morning after the flood, standing at the field's edge in the grey light. The way she'd thought of his father, not with grief exactly, but with a kind of consultation, the way you consult someone who knows things you need to know. The moment in the rain in August, standing in the field while it fell, when she had felt something that she could only call gratitude, though gratitude to what or to whom she couldn't have said. She told him that the farm was not just the farm, that it was also a record of everyone who had worked it, going back to August Voss in 1931, going back further to whoever had lived on that land before August Voss, going back to the creek that had been cutting through that bottomland for longer than any deed recorded, that when you farm a piece of ground, you become part of that record, you become part of what the soil remembers. She told him that she had not saved the farm. The farm had given her a season, and she had given the season everything she had, and it had been enough. Barely, honestly, sometimes in ways she still didn't fully understand, but enough. She told him she was okay. She folded the letter, put it in an envelope, addressed it, and put it in the pocket of the coat on the hook by the door to mail the next time she drove to town. She made tea. She looked out the window at the snow coming down on the fields. In the distance, past the tree line, the creek was frozen solid, quiet, contained, nothing like what it had been in May. She thought about Carlyle. She thought about what he would think of how the year had gone. She thought he would have had notes. He always had notes, but that he would have been satisfied, not proud exactly, satisfied. The way you are when a thing that was supposed to hold, holds. She thought about the seeds that had gone in the ground late and come out with 81% of what she'd contracted, and she thought, that's what farmers know that other people don't. The land doesn't owe you anything. You bring yourself to it, and you work, and you hope, and sometimes, not always, but sometimes, the hope and the work are enough. She finished her tea. The snow kept falling. I want to sit with you here for a moment before we close out. Because this story, Una's story, this particular stretch of Harlan County, this flood and this crop and this woman who refused to sell, it asks something of you. Not your money, not your land, not your labor. Just a moment of recognition. Recognition that the people who hold things together, who don't let the weight collapse them, who don't take the easy exit, who plant late because planting late is still planting, those people are not always the ones who make headlines. They're the ones who leave notes on kitchen tables, who check soil moisture at night with a probe, who say thank you to a neighbor for seed and mean it in a way that goes deeper than politeness. They're the ones who, when a developer calls to offer a way out, say no, not because they don't understand the risk, but because they understand something else more. Una is still farming, the land is still the land. And that, all by itself, is a kind of victory that doesn't photograph well but doesn't need to. If this story stayed with you, I want you to do 3 things. Leave a comment and tell me what city you're watching from. Tell me if you know someone like Una. Tell me if you've ever had to stand your ground when everything was telling you to let go. Hit the like button, not because algorithms, but because it helps these stories reach the people who need them. And subscribe, because next time we're going back into the kind of history that gets quietly buried, and we're going to dig it up together. I'll see you there.